In November 1990, after more than 11 years in power, Margaret Thatcher left office. Far from being voted out in a general election, the Conservative Prime Minister was ousted out of Number 10 by members of her own parliamentary party in a manner redolent of intrigue and full of high drama. Only a year before, the Prime Minister had declared herself fit for 10 more years. Retirement from the top job was not on her agenda, but while the end was traumatic for Mrs. Thatcher, the warning signs had been visible for some time.
We're now in Smith Square. Mrs. Thatcher has arrived.
It's not uncommon for political careers to end in tears. In the case of a Prime Minister, from the moment of their first cabinet reshuffle, they create potential enemies keen to see their leader cast out. For Prime Minister Thatcher, the incident that would foretell her later downfall came in the middle of her premiership. It would expose splits within government and feature the resignation of not one, but 2 cabinet ministers.
Mrs. Thatcher has been under a lot of pressure from dismayed Tories to end the damaging row over Westland. She came to the Cabinet this morning determined to put a stop to Mr. Heseltine's vigorous and highly public campaigning.
By December 1985, the row inside government over who should buy out Westland helicopters had spiralled out of control. Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine favoured a European consortium, whereas Trade and Industry Secretary Leon Brittan preferred an American option, also supported by Mrs. Thatcher. Furious that in his view he was not being listened to, Michael Heseltine resigned.
I have today tendered my resignation from the government, not because of the discussion at today's cabinet, but because of the way that the reconstruction of Westland plc has been handled over a period of months.
Then, following his departure, he engaged in a war of words accusing Mrs. Thatcher of being complicit in efforts to undermine him and forcing Leon Brittan out of office.
I think any minister has got to have the full confidence of his colleagues. I didn't have any doubt about that until this morning. This morning I made inquiries, I discussed the matter with friends and colleagues, and I came to the conclusion that I didn't have the full confidence without which you can't really do the job.
With 2 cabinet resignations in as many weeks, Mrs. Thatcher's authority was now in question.
The tactics of it all became very confused. But what did not become confused was the Prime Minister's loss of authority over what was happening. Whatever the truth about this letter or that, or this publication or that, what was quite clear is that, amazingly, the Iron Lady had lost control.
She knew that if things had turned very badly against her, and if she was not able to carry her own party and her own backbenchers with her, then there was a real risk, just that she was not going to be Prime Minister anymore. So that was the first really serious wobble.
But if her fellow ministers thought Mrs. Thatcher would learn from the experience, they were wrong.
Towards the end, she became more presidential. She began to believe her own propaganda, began to fly by the seat of her pants, and her intuition was no longer as sound as it had been when she started, and it did become irritating towards the end.
Heseltine's resignation was clearly a dangerous moment for Mrs. Thatcher, but one she survived. Indeed, in the following year she was re-elected for a 3rd term. The campaign, though, was not the happiest.
In Central Office itself, in Smith Square, there were these extremely serious disagreements, particularly after one quite early bad poll. What happened was she brought in a sort of rival campaign operation. So you had Lord Tebbett's campaign, but you had another select group that she picked to run almost a rival campaign, and there was terrible friction.
She should have saved our money. We could all have gone on 3 weeks holiday and we'd have had a perfectly... The public could see that Thatcherism was working.
It is wonderful to be entrusted with the government of this country, this great country, once again. And I want to say this to you. The greater the trust, the greater the duty upon us to be worthy of that trust. And we will indeed endeavour to serve the people of these islands in the future as we have in the past.
8 years into her premiership, and Mrs. Thatcher looked invincible. It was also said she was becoming increasingly intolerant of those who disagreed with her and less willing to listen, particularly to the pro-European lobby within the Tory party.
It became an increasing problem in the cabinet. I mean, I was in the cabinet by the late 1980s, and I was in the cabinet when we were doing the Single European Act. But as time went on, we could pick up the fact that she was getting more scratchy about Europe, and various European issues began to come up. And I didn't realize, because the three of them were so discreet about it, that she, Geoffrey and Nigel were falling out so badly over monetary policy, really, the ERM, and whether or not we were going to join the ERM, and whether or not we were engaging in what became the construction of the single currency. Margaret had a kind of blind spot on that.
In Brussels, the talk was all of economic and monetary union. There was even discussion of a European social charter. Mrs. Thatcher was less than impressed, and in a speech to the College of Europe in Bruges in September 1988, she set out her views of what the European community should be and what it should not.
Europe will be stronger precisely because it has France as France, Spain as Spain, Britain as Britain, each with its own customs, traditions and identity. It would be folly to try to fit them into some sort of identikit European personality. We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
The speech did not go down well with other European leaders, and the pro-Europeans in the party started to despair.
The Bruges speech was certainly not fair to describe it as an anti-European speech. It was a revisionist European speech. It was trying to move away from trends in European development which she didn't like. But she had not carried her senior ministers with her, and her relations with them were poor, and so were her relations with Jacques Delors and various other people, Helmut Kohl. And so she was sort of in an antagonistic position.
Mrs. Thatcher, though, knew the mood among Tory party supporters, as was evidenced by the ecstatic welcome she received at the party conference the following month.
One interesting thing about Mrs. Thatcher's position on Europe was that it was always quite popular, except, and it's turned out to be fatal, with her senior colleagues.
The divisions within the cabinet were growing stronger. By 1989, the relationship between Geoffrey Howe and Mrs. Thatcher had broken down. Their political marriage was heading towards a messy divorce. In July 1989, Mrs. Thatcher reshuffled her cabinet and dropped Geoffrey Howe as Foreign Secretary. He was made leader of the House and given the title Deputy Prime Minister.
It remains to be seen how much long-term damage has been done to the government. Mrs. Thatcher may have created enemies who are very close to her. It may be that in the run-up to the election, she'll have reason to regret that.
Geoffrey Howe began to irritate the Prime Minister by the way, the slow, measured way in which he'd like to argue a case, and by his unwillingness to sort of leap quickly to fresh conclusions. And she didn't realize, I think she genuinely didn't realize how badly she was reacting to this, how it showed, and how much offence he was taking. He was very badly treated in cabinet and outside.
3 months later, and a disgruntled Chancellor was about to resign. Nigel Lawson walked out in protest at being upstaged, second-guessed, and, as he perceived it, attacked by Mrs. Thatcher's economics advisor, Alan Walters. The issue was Europe, the exchange rate mechanism, and economic and monetary union.
This is the man who Mr. Lawson felt he couldn't work alongside. Sir Alan Walters, seen here at his home in Washington, was refusing to comment to ITN.
You appreciate there's a substantial row going on in the British papers about this, do you, sir?
Yeah, I say nothing.
Have you changed your mind at all?
The biggest row of all, really, was about whether or not we joined the ERM, which Nigel Lawson had been converted to the idea that we should, and had been defeated, first of all, in a meeting in November 1985, but it continued as a running sore. Walters, very, very keen not to join the ERM, always backing up Mrs. Thatcher on this. Lawson pushing. And so gradually you had a development of a separate policy in which the Chancellor does one thing and the Prime Minister is always arguing for the other. So it was heading for the rocks.
John Major, who'd been appointed to replace Geoffrey Howe as Foreign Secretary and who'd only been in the job 3 months, was now made Chancellor.
I think Mrs Thatcher chose Major partly for good reasons, that he was, he was a rising star and he was able and he had that ability to get on with all sorts of people. He was an emollient figure. She also believed him to be a loyal part of her project, which was not really the case. I don't think he ever was a Thatcherite, but he's a good flatterer, and she believed that he was. And I think she found it easier to deal with people who were really the next generation down than the people she'd been with all the time.
Next came the first challenge to Thatcher's leadership. In December, backbencher and lifelong European Sir Anthony Mayer launched his campaign to topple the leader. Nobody else joined in and Mrs Thatcher won an easy victory, but it was another sign that there was a growing movement for change.
I'd like to say how very pleased I am with this result, and very pleased I am to have had the overwhelming support of my colleagues in the House and of people from the party in the country.
Nobody thought Anthony Mayer could be Prime Minister, least of all Anthony himself. He knew perfectly well that was not his temperament, not his style. He couldn't conceivably have done it. But just to put down a marker in the hope that her power would be checked and controlled, it paved the way to her in the end being deposed. But at the time, I think all these people were doing was making themselves feel better by registering their severe discontent and concern.
If Euro enthusiasts were dejected, others were alarmed by Mrs Thatcher's intransigence over a new community charge dubbed the poll tax. It was intended to replace the old rating system and was set for full implementation by April 1990. The plans attracted widespread criticism and provoked public unrest. Detractors claimed the plans were flawed and the new tax would be expensive and more difficult to collect than the rates. But not even rioting could stop the charge being introduced.
Nothing but nothing that warrants this. The place to discuss these matters is Parliament. These people are totally against democracy.
She couldn't understand the opposition to the poll tax. She felt very strongly by then that if people were made to pay their actual share, as it were, of the costs of local government and that they didn't like it, then the democratic process would work and that they would then go and turf out their local councils. But of course, local government is not like national government, partly because of the low turnout in local elections for a start. People are not quite that politically activated or minded. And what she didn't realise is that people would look at this and say it's an unfair tax.
By autumn 1990, Labour was averaging a lead of 13 points in the opinion polls. The mood at the Tories' annual conference was subdued. In an attempt to try and lift their spirits, Mrs Thatcher used an attack on the Liberal Democrats to tell a joke.
As for the Liberal Democrats, they were as dead as Monty Python's parrot.
It is not merely stunned, it has ceased to be, expired and gone to meet its maker.
She was trying to make the point that the Liberals were a spent force. I'm told that when she went through the first rehearsal, apparently she looked up and said, is this meant to be funny? And they said, yes, Prime Minister, it's based on the Monty Python. I said, really? I mean, will people laugh when they say? And they said, they really will. Oh. Well, I must say, and she tried it once again, and apparently she herself never really got the point.
The joke backfired. Tory MP Sir Ian Gow had been murdered earlier in the summer, and a by-election was subsequently held to elect his replacement. On the 19th of October, the people of Eastbourne delivered a blow to the Tories by voting in a Lib Dem with a dramatic swing of 20%.
It'll be a moment that people will remember. It'll be a moment when they remember the great hopes that so many voted for at the last election for a decent alternative to the Tories and Labour Party come alive again.
So the stage was set. The divisions within the parliamentary party over the community charge and Europe, plus bad poll ratings and rising inflation, were all fanning the flames of discontent. A potential challenger, Michael Heseltine, was waiting in the wings. Now all that was needed was a trigger, and it came from the most mild-mannered member of Thatcher's cabinet. Geoffrey Howe had accepted his dismissal from the Foreign Office, but he finally fell out with Mrs. Thatcher over the European single currency. At the end of October, while Mrs. Thatcher was at a summit in Rome, Geoffrey Howe went on television and suggested the government was not against the principle of a single currency. Mrs. Thatcher was furious.
For some reason, she'd formed this view with Geoffrey, not, I think, when he was in the Treasury, but when he got to the Foreign Office. And from that moment on, she behaved, I think, in a totally hectoring and sort of disgraceful kind of bullying manner to him. And he put up with it for 6-7 years, but eventually that was it.
When Margaret Thatcher rebutted Howe's remarks in the House of Commons and further rejected Jacques Delors' plan for Europe with a vigorous no, 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 Geoffrey Howe felt he had no option but to resign.
Geoffrey, I'm told, remonstrated with Mrs. Thatcher over her tone on Europe. She went for him in no uncertain terms. 6 hours later, he decided he'd had enough of that sort of treatment and resigned.
The fact that Margaret and I had moved so far apart from each other on central question of policy, foreign policy, European policy, and as I said in my resignation speech, that involved a conflict of loyalty. I had been loyal to Margaret, and we'd been loyal to each other for 16 years. That was a very strong feature in my mind, obviously. On the other hand, I'd been strongly in favour of a strong British position in Europe for a very long time indeed. I felt that the way we were going was threatening to destroy that British interest. That was the key feature. But we'd also drifted apart in terms of the partnership which had worked so well for so many years. The magic had gone out of the relationship. I've often said people should concentrate on our long marriage, not on our divorce.
During the first weekend of November, there was a renewed bout of leadership contest fever. Sensing the mood and applying Tory party rules, Mrs. Thatcher cleared the way for a leadership challenge, setting a date of the 15th of November for the close of nominations and the 20th of November for the first ballot. Initially, there was no firm challenge, only an atrocious by-election result.
Labour's victory in Bradford North was never in question, but the scale of it has further undermined Tory morale. Despite the Conservative candidate's attempts to put a brave face on it, it was the third largest fall in the Tory vote in a by-election since Mrs. Thatcher came to power.
Geoffrey Howe had also made it clear he would be making a speech setting out the reasons for his resignation. His announcement came in response to Mrs. Thatcher's speech following the state opening of Parliament, in which she insisted there were no significant differences between them on European policy. On the 12th of November, the Prime Minister addressed the Lord Mayor's banquet. In it, she started comparing herself to a cricketer facing hostile bowling. But, she said,
there will be no ducking the bouncers, no stonewalling, no playing for time. The bowling's going to get hit all round the ground. That's my style.
The cricketing metaphor proved a mistake, as the next day Geoffrey Howe picked up her sporting references with devastating effect.
It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find the moment the first balls are bowled that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
Then he delivered the killer blow.
The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
I decided that if one's going to resign at all, then, as people advised me, one needs to make clear people understand why one's resigning. And to make a speech in those circumstances which didn't get that across was a damp squib, as it were, would not have been a sensible thing to do. It had to make an impact, and I spelled it out as clearly as I could, but as candidly and as sadly as I could. That's why I ended up by saying I'd wrestled for so long with this conflict of loyalty.
Some of us had tried to warn her, but she hadn't hoisted it in. I think she was genuinely surprised and shocked that someone who had been such a good ally, she was suddenly, as she saw it, turned against her.
The next day, Michael Heseltine announced he would stand for the leadership. Margaret Thatcher was immediately nominated by Douglas Hurd and seconded by John Major. The campaign was underway.
We've got to have a rethink of the community charge. Michael has promised that. The other good thing about Michael is that his track record in my constituency, in Tavistock, where he was the former Member of Parliament, shows that his keynote quality is that he listens.
The challenge was a perfectly legitimate one, but it aroused in her mind great irritation. And certainly it came as a shock. And in the final days, she had to decide whether to go and sign the European Treaty in Paris, not an EU treaty, but a big one with the Americans and others. And people advised her to stay and canvass in the tea room. In those days, the leadership was entirely a matter for members of Parliament. But I thought, as Foreign Secretary, she ought to do her job as Prime Minister, and that it would be a sign of weakness, and interpreted as a sign of weakness, if she didn't go to Paris.
It's clear that Mrs. Thatcher and those close to her do believe they're going to win in the first ballot.
I most earnestly believe that I shall be in number 10 Downing Street at the end of this week, and a little bit longer than that.
On the following day, Tuesday, the 20th of November, the result of the first ballot was phoned through to the British Embassy in Paris. Mrs. Thatcher had won, but her majority was not big enough. There would be a second ballot.
My own view was that this was a Prime Minister who'd done absolutely necessary things for the country, and that she ought only to be overthrown either in a general election or by a vote in the House of Commons. And I didn't think, and particularly when I moved among foreigners that night in Versailles with a great French dinner, when I listened to people like Cole, listened to people who knew Margaret Thatcher well, who most of them carried scars that she'd inflicted on them, but nevertheless they had a huge respect for her. And they couldn't understand how it was possible in the British system for a Prime Minister with a majority like that in the House of Commons to be overthrown from within her own party. And I listening to them and thinking about it, I came to the conclusion that wasn't right either. So that's why I went on supporting her right through.
In London the next day, Mrs. Thatcher made it clear she was not about to quit.
I fight on, I fight to win.
Later, on returning to Downing Street, she had a stream of visitors, including, one at a time, most of the cabinet. All the ministers promised their support, but many expressed the view that she couldn't win. Kenneth Clarke, then Education Secretary, was more blunt. He advised her to step down.
I think the reason I was the first cabinet minister to be called in was because of a conversation I'd had with, I think, John Wakeham earlier in the day. I'd been rung up and asked if I would take over the leadership of her campaign for the second ballot. And I reacted to that so angrily, along the lines of what campaign? Why isn't anybody pointing out to her she has lost and she should step down? I'm not going to vote for her in the second round, let alone campaign for her in the second round. I've been obviously bitten the head off one of my friends on the phone. So she'd obviously been advised that I was in some truculent mood and she'd better see me first to help handle the others. And she failed to persuade me.
It was a long night, and despite pledges of support and even promises to campaign for her, the overall message was that she couldn't win. At the next day's cabinet meeting on the 22nd of November, Mrs. Thatcher announced her resignation as leader of the party and as Prime Minister.
This is a typically brave and selfless decision by the Prime Minister. Once again, Margaret Thatcher has put her country's and party's interests before personal considerations. This will allow the party to elect a new leader who will unite the party and build upon her immense successes.
That afternoon, Mrs. Thatcher made her last speech to the House of Commons. It was a bravura performance.
She turned round and she said to the audience, "I'm enjoying this, I'm enjoying this." And she was absolutely at her peak.
The field was now open for others to enter the race. Michael Heseltine was joined by Douglas Hurd and John Major in the battle for the leadership.
The Prime Minister announced a very sad decision this morning. I believe the overriding need now is for the Conservative Party to find a leader who can unite it in handling present problems and in winning the next general election.
Mrs. Thatcher backed Major.
Many years later, I was sitting next to Margaret Thatcher at a dinner for Ted Heath, and she'd made a nice speech about Ted and so on, and she said to me privately afterwards, "I learned an awful lot from Ted Heath," etc. And we went on to that a bit. And then she said the real problem for the party was over there, and she indicated John Major, who was sitting a few places behind. And I said, but Margaret, you say that, but why then did you tell everyone to vote for him? And she lowered her voice, forgetting entirely my role in this in 1990. She lowered her voice and said, I'll say to you something that I wouldn't tell everybody. He was the best of a very poor bunch, she said.
John Major was elected to the leadership. Mrs. Thatcher left Downing Street for the last time on the 28th of November, 1990.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.
But then the Iron Lady's composure almost broke. Watch her face as she reaches her car. She recovered quickly for one last wave. Friends say, though, that she is deeply shocked by the seeming injustice of it all. 3 election victories and a clear, though insufficient, majority in the first ballot, rewarded, as she sees it, with the sack.
On arriving at her home in Dulwich, Mrs. Thatcher bravely declared she'd be back at work the next day.
We should be in Parliament tomorrow. I went across to the House today to establish my office, to get everything running.
We've always worked, Mrs. Thatcher added. It's the only thing we know.
7 months after she left office, and in an interview with ITN's political editor Michael Brunson, Mrs. Thatcher would recall her last days as Prime Minister.
Well, could I just, first of all, ask you to recall what must have been a very difficult meeting of the Cabinet?
Yes, of course it was. Of course it was. You don't take a decision like that without it being difficult, without heartbreak. Heartbreak there may have been, but it was the right decision.
But you had to get through it. Bernard Ingham, in his memoirs, has said that it was a traumatic experience. Those are his words.
Yes, it was. And it would have been very strange if it hadn't been. But we got through it.
In fact, you broke down.
We got through the House.
You broke down during that Cabinet, didn't you?
Yes, but I carried on.
And then the House.
By that time, I was back fighting fit, as you saw.
Just before that, though, the image that people will perhaps remember, you said the Cabinet was extremely difficult. And then you had to come out into Downing Street. And you had to face the cameras. In effect, you had to face the world. You had to come and make what was perhaps the statement of your life. And then I see that, we notice now that it's affecting you now, and it must have been
yes,
the most difficult.
Yes, it's not affecting my voice now. It's not affecting my voice. You're thinking back to traumatic things. But I managed to get through them. I managed to get through the television. I managed to get through the Cabinet, again, because there was something else to do. I had to get on to people, and I must say this, but Douglas Hurd and John Major said, if you wish to go on, we will propose you and second you again. And that was marvellous. That was marvellous. And then one had to get through Cabinet, and 1 or 2 people wanted to leave because they too, of course, wanted to make provision for their own candidature. Quite right. Quite right. But by that time, I had other things to do, and so I got on with them.
I think she always simply saw it as betrayal. She used the phrase quite openly, many, many times, about she'd been betrayed, she'd been stabbed in the back, there were these people who she thought she could rely on, and when it came to it, they wouldn't stand by me. Of course, that was rewriting history, because what she was having to deal with was political reality. It wasn't a case of stabbing her in the back, it was a case of people coming in, notably, of course, Kenneth Clarke, who were prepared to be blunt with her and to say that, no, they would not be able to support her if she continued in the way that she did.
The Iron Lady was defeated. By all parliamentary standards, this had been a brutal way to oust a sitting Prime Minister. After 11 years and 6 months, Mrs. Thatcher was consigned to the back benches to sit among the very people who had brought about her downfall. The Thatcher years were finally over, and no one could quite believe it. In the next programme, Margaret Thatcher's legacy, from her impact on domestic policy to her role on the world stage, and her influence over the future of politics in Britain.
You can order Margaret Thatcher, A Tribute in Words and Pictures, for the special half-price fee of £10. Call Telegraph Books on 0870 155 7222 or order online at www.books.telegraph.co.uk.